Good evening with Alaska Weather. This is David Kramer. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. Check out any updates to the forecasts or any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get updates to the forecast through that means as well. And email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the advisories that we have out for the state. Now, we did have some warnings out for southeast Alaska, as well as an advisory up by the Skagway area. Those are all expiring here very soon. We're expecting that snow to calm down and those winds as well. If you do have pictures of any of the recent snowfall in the area, feel free to send those to us. Again, my email is david.kramer@noaa.gov. Along the west coast of the state, however, we still have some active winter weather advisories. All of these are for blowing snow. We'll start up north for the Chukchi Sea coastline. That one is in effect until 4 a.m. on Thursday. We're going to see some winds accompanying the blowing snow up to as high as 40 miles per hour. And for blowing snow in all of these locations, it could drop visibilities down to a half mile or less at times. For the Bering Strait coast area, that one's in effect until 7 a.m. on Thursday with gusts up to as high as 45 miles per hour. For the Yukon Delta area, that's going to be in effect until 10 p.m. this evening for gusts up to 40 miles per hour with that blowing snow. And then for the Eastern Norton Sound and Nulato Hills area, that's going to be in effect until 10 p.m. this evening as well, and for 40 mile per hour gusts. Again, all of these are winter weather advisories for blowing snow that could drop the visibility down to a half mile or less at times. For our satellite imagery, we'll start off with the low out over the eastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska that's pushed its way in north of Sitka area, and it's bringing a lot of precipitation to the Panhandle. We have another low that you can see moving through the Norton Sound area into the western mainland that's helping to bring some of those blowing snow conditions along the west coast. And we have a system way out west by the western Aleutians that's pushing in some different precipitation and warmer air to the western Aleutian Islands. And you can see the cloud cover out ahead of this system pushing out over much of the central Bering Sea down by the eastern Aleutian Islands area. As we look at the weather for the remainder of the day, we can see that trough associated with that more easterly cloud cover out over the Bering, bringing some snow and rain mix to the eastern Aleutians, as well as some snow ahead of that by the Pribilof Islands, extending out over much of the central and western Bering Sea. But behind this, as we get closer towards that more western system, we are going to see a lot more warm air, and we do have some rain out for the central Aleutian Islands and a mix of rain and snow for the western Aleutians. Out ahead of this system with our low out over mainland Alaska pushing into the western mainland, it's bringing some snow down into the the Bristol Bay area, out for the southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, up into much of the central and western portions of mainland Alaska, up as far north as the Brooks Range. Behind this low, we do have those areas of blowing snow extending down from the Chukchi Sea coastline to the St. Lawrence Island area and down into the Yukon Delta area as well. Out over the far southeastern portions of mainland, we do have some areas of snow that are going to extend through the Yakutat area and down into the Panhandle. Northern locations of the Panhandle are expected to stay snow, but as we get to central and southern locations, it's going to be a mix of rain and snow. As we move into the nighttime hours, we have some more rain trying to peek in through the southern portions of the Panhandle, but primarily snow, especially as we get to central and northern locations of the Panhandle. Low out near the Prince William Sound area is going to bring some snow throughout south central Alaska, as well as pushing up into the interior and much of the western mainland, out as far west as the Kotzebue Sound area. Up along the Arctic coastline, we do have some areas of fog developing overnight, and then continued areas of blowing snow along the Chukchi Sea coast as well as the Bering Strait coast. Down in the Bering Sea area, we're going to have snow extending in through the Pribilof Islands and down into the Alaska Peninsula, and our front pushing in towards the central Aleutian Islands is going to bring rain to the islands, as well as starting to push some of that rain into the western Aleutians. As we move into Thursday, that front pushes farther to the east, bringing some more rain and a rain-snow mix to the eastern Aleutian Islands. And out behind this, we're starting to see some of the colder air wrap back around, going to bring a rain and snow mix to the western Aleutians, and still cold enough out over the Pribilof Islands and other areas of the central and northern portion of the Bering Sea to see primarily snow. That snow is also going to extend down through the Alaska Peninsula area. Out over mainland Alaska, west coast should be Pretty dry from new precipitation. However, there are going to be some areas of blowing snow along the Chukchi Sea coast area. And then we're going to have some snow for the central portions of the interior extending out east and down into the Copper River Basin area. Along the Arctic coast, going to see some more snow up there. And then finally down in the Panhandle area, low pressure out over the northern portion of the Gulf of Alaska. It's going to bring some flow off the water, bringing more precipitation to the northern portions of the Panhandle. Primarily going to be snow, and that's going to extend out for the Yakutat area as well. Finally, on Thursday, that low is going to push off further to the east, but still bringing precipitation out through much of the Panhandle area. That's going to extend further south now. We are going to see snow throughout much of the area of the Panhandle, from Yakutat down through the Metlakatla area. Up in the mainland portions of the state, not a lot of new precipitation for most locations. There are going to be some lingering snow out over the Alaska Range and up along the Arctic coastline, especially in the more eastern locations. Down the west coast of the state, some blowing snow areas around St. Lawrence Island, and our front that was out over the Bering Sea is continuing to push farther to the east. There was some rain for the eastern Aleutians starting to make their way into the Alaska Peninsula as well, but snow out ahead of this for much of the Alaska Peninsula, extending out for the northern portions of the Bering Sea, and some of the colder air again wrapping around for the western and central Aleutian Islands, bringing a rain and snow mix to those locations. For our low temperatures, we'll start off Thursday morning for the Panhandle area, lower to mid-30s most locations, a little bit warmer as we get farther to the south, and then for the Yakutat area, 27 degrees. Near the coastline for the south central areas in the teens, but getting to below zero temperatures for much of the more interior locations. Anchorage is going to be an exception, staying a little bit warmer there at 10 degrees. Kodiak down to 25. Up in the interior, most all locations are going to drop below zero, getting colder as we get farther to the north. Yukon Flats area dropping down to minus 24, and then up through the Arctic Village area down to minus 29. Along the Arctic coastline and western locations down into the negative teens and negative 20s as we get farther to the east. Down the west coast of the state, below zero into the single digits for most locations. And then as we move down into southwest Alaska, below zero or near zero for much of the YK Delta area. Same for the Bristol Bay area. A little bit warmer as we get to the Alaska Peninsula, into the mid to upper 20s for most locations, and then the mid 30s for the Aleutian Islands, 28 degrees for St. Paul. For our high temperatures Thursday afternoon, starting off in the Panhandle area, lower 40s for southern locations, upper 30s as we get farther to the north, and mid 30s by Yakutat. For south central locations, in the mid 20s for most locations, staying a little bit cooler in the Glen Allen area, only getting up to 16 degrees. As we move up into the interior of the state, southern locations going to get up into the teens, but as we get farther to the north, we're going to see temperatures staying in the single digits with 8 degrees for Bettles, 5 out by Ambler, and then up into the Brooks Range, only going to get to the negative single digits. That's going to be true along the western portions of the North Slope as well, and then down to near negative 10, or rather only getting up to near negative 10 for the Dead Horse area. Along the west coast of the state, most locations will get up into the single digits, but out by Wales area and Shishmaref, we're going to stay a little bit colder there. Down into the southwestern portions of the state, YK Delta area, right around 10 degrees for those highs, and into the mid-teens for the Bristol Bay area. For the Alaska Peninsula, into the mid to upper 30s as we get further to the west, going to be a little bit warmer, and then into the lower 40s for the central and eastern Aleutians, Shimmy only getting up to 38, 33 for the Pribilof Islands. Friday morning low temperatures in the Panhandle area, dropping down into near freezing for much of the southern locations, and into the 20s as we get farther to the north. For south central locations, near 10 degrees along the Gulf coastline, but going into single digits and many places below zero as we get to more interior locations, minus 9 for Glen Allen, minus 8 for Talkeetna and Kenai. As we move into the interior, all locations are going to be below zero, minus teens for many of the southern locations, minus 20s as we get farther to the north, especially in the more eastern locations. Up along the Arctic coastline, minus teens out west, and near minus 20 as we get farther to the east. Right around minus 10 for much of the west coast of the state, and below zero for all the locations along southwest until we get right by the Bering Sea waters. For the Alaska Peninsula, near freezing, and then mid-30s for the Aleutian Islands. Afternoon highs for Friday for the Panhandle area going to be primarily in the 30s, a little bit warmer farther to the south. In the 20s for much of south central Alaska, colder in the Copper River Basin. In the teens for southern interior, single digits up north, and staying below zero along the Arctic coastline. Single digits also along much of the west coast of the state. And then down in the southwestern portions, teens by the YK Delta, 20s for the Bristol Bay area. Aleutians are going to stay right around 40 degrees.
And now, Aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we can see the front moving through that is bringing some IFR conditions through the central Bering as well as down in the eastern Aleutian Islands with MVFR conditions elsewhere. Out over the southern portions of the mainland, we have a mixture of MVFR and IFR scattered in with the primarily VFR conditions, primarily VFR in the interior as well, but once again some scattered MVFR and IFR conditions. Along the north slope, however, we are going to see primarily IFR conditions, and right along the coastline we'll see some more MVFR. Down in the Panhandle area, a mixture of VFR, IFR, and MVFR all throughout the area. Primarily those IFR conditions are going to be by the coastal mountains. Thursday afternoon going to clear up for the southern areas of the Panhandle. However, lingering MVFR conditions are expected farther to the north. Head over south central Alaska, eastern locations are going to see some MVFR conditions. And then for the southern portions of the interior, we are going to see some MVFR as well. Primarily VFR conditions in the afternoon along the Arctic coastline as well as down the west coast of the state. Out through the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we're going to see primarily IFR conditions with some MVFR conditions out by the western Aleutians. For Friday morning, still going to see a lot of IFR conditions throughout much of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. However, out over mainland Alaska, going to see a lot of VFR conditions for south central, and then some MVFR conditions developing in the interior that extend down to southwest Alaska. Also some MVFR along the north slope. Down in the Panhandle area, primarily MVFR, but as we get to the coastal mountains, we will see some more IFR conditions. Friday afternoon, clearing up in the northern portions of the Panhandle, but lingering MVFR conditions down south. For much of mainland Alaska, we're going to see VFR conditions. However, some areas in the eastern interior are going to see some MVFR, and then down by Bristol Bay, we're going to see some IFR down there as well. It's going to extend out through the Pribilof Islands and up into the northern Bering. Out over much of the rest of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, primarily MVFR conditions are expected. For the passes, AKwx should start off MVFR and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. However, the north slope will see some IFR conditions, especially in the morning. As we look into Adigan Pass, similarly, we're going to see MVFR in the morning, improving to VFR conditions, and then IFR out over the north slope, primarily again in the morning hours. For Lake Clark, we're going to see VFR conditions throughout the day, but Merrill will start off MVFR and then also improve to VFR conditions. Rainy Pass should be MVFR throughout the day Thursday. Windy Pass will start off IFR and then improve to MVFR. Isabel Pass will also start off IFR, improving to MVFR in the afternoon. Mentasta Pass should be MVFR throughout the day Thursday. Tanita Pass should be VFR throughout the day, as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White will both start off IFR and improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. For our freezing levels, surface freezing line rides to the northern portions of the Bering Sea, down through the Alaska Peninsula area, up to the North Gulf coastline, and then into the Panhandle. We have some warmer air out by the western Aleutian Islands with freezing levels up to as high as 4,000 feet. And then out in the southern portions of the Panhandle, freezing levels above 2,000 feet are expected. For our icing out over the southern portions of the Panhandle, above 3,000 feet is expected. Above 2,000 feet as we get closer towards the Yakutat area. By the eastern Aleutian Islands on the Pacific side between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, but as we get closer towards the Pribilof Islands, below 10,000 feet is expected. Out by the western Aleutian Islands, between 1,000 and 4,000 feet is expected. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is out by the central Aleutian Islands out of a west to southwest direction, 95 to 110 knots. We have a branch of the jet out of a northwesterly direction moving through the Barren Islands area at 95 knots. And then out over the southeastern portion of the state, we have south to southwest directions around 75 knots. For 9,000 feet, we have some stronger winds out over the Gulf of Alaska out of a west to northwest direction up to as high as 50 knots, dropping down over southwest Alaska at 35 knots. Out over the Panhandle area, 25 knots out of the southwest, and by Yakutat, 45 knots out of a southerly direction. Up along the Arctic coastline, especially out west, we're going to see easterly winds 30 knots. And then down for the central Aleutian Islands, strongest winds there out of the southwest 15 knots, dropping down to 35 for the eastern and western Aleutian Islands. For 3,000 feet, some stronger winds in the western portion of the Gulf, or the Bering rather, 55 to 60 knots out of a southeasterly direction. 30 knots by Shimia Island area out of a westerly direction. For the central Aleutians, west winds up to as high as 35 knots. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, we're seeing some northwest flow at about 35 knots coming through the Barren Islands area. And then up along the Kotzebue Sound area, northerly winds up to as high as 20 knots are expected. For our turbulence, we do have some areas for the central and western Aleutian Islands below 3,000 feet as expected, with some of the stronger winds out there. And then stretching from Kodiak Island to the eastern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, we are expecting some turbulence below 5,000 feet.
On March 11, 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake off the Pacific coast of Japan generated a tsunami. This series of ocean waves sped towards the island nation, with waves reaching 24 feet high. The result was devastation and utter destruction. Towns were engulfed by water and swept away. Farmland was flooded. Tens of thousands of lives were lost. The National Police Agency reported damages to hundreds of roads, bridges, and more than 100,000 buildings. The surging water flooded rivers and destroyed harbors. In some areas along the coast, tsunami waves reached 6 miles inland. Tsunamis not only cause severe damage when they first strike land, but also as the water recedes back to sea. Tsunamis can inflict this type of damage because of some unique features. As tsunami waves travel across ocean basins, they may be as little as a few centimeters high, but they extend down to the ocean floor. This is different than traditional waves, which are only surface features. Tsunamis can also travel hundreds of miles per hour in the open ocean. As these waves approach a coast, the shallowing ocean floor slows the waves down and pushes the water mass upwards. The quicker the ocean floor transitions from deep to shallow, the greater potential for a higher wave height. So, tsunamis that experience this sudden shift into shallow water can have the height and momentum to pack a serious punch. Unfortunately, Japan found itself in this scenario. This image shows how abruptly the Japanese islands rise out of the ocean. Other coastal areas in the region have much more gradual slopes. The earthquake on March 11th was the most powerful known to hit Japan, and the tsunami it created had the necessary ingredients to make it such a deadly and destructive force. "80 miles east of Japan, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake rocks the ocean floor. This disturbance causes a transfer of energy from the seafloor to the ocean, generating a series of ocean waves, known as a tsunami. In about 20 minutes, waves strike the Japanese coastline. Other nations go on high alert because the tsunami will propagate or spread throughout the Pacific Ocean. As the tsunami radiates outward from Japan, it encounters a variety of ocean features, such as ridges and underwater volcanoes, which guide the tsunami and create a complex pattern of scattering and reflective waves. In 8 hours, the waves reach the Hawaiian Islands, and in 9.5 hours, they hit the west coast of the United States. In 16 hours, the tsunami reaches the Indian Ocean and New Zealand, and by 22 hours, the entire Pacific Ocean had been affected. The impact of a tsunami can be highly variable because of the complicated interactions with ocean features and coastline elements. Wave height and speed will differ from place to place. Since tsunamis can be hundreds of miles long and travel thousands of miles away from where they originated, they are considered a worldwide threat when they form. These are the sounds of a tsunami warning. They alert residents that a killer wave is about to strike. These sirens, however, are just a small part of the sophisticated warning systems that played a role in Japan and in the US during the Pacific Ocean tsunami in March 2011. Most tsunamis are generated by an undersea earthquake. Fortunately, Japan has one of the most advanced earthquake early warning systems in the world. It detects tremors, calculates the epicenter, and sends out warnings from over 1,000 seismographs scattered throughout the country. The Japan Meteorological Agency issues the warnings and sends alerts to television and radio channels, the internet, and mobile phone networks. When the earthquake struck 80 miles offshore, warnings were generated in about 3 seconds. The tsunami warnings came 3 minutes later. These take longer because more complex calculations are involved and must factor in ocean data. Since the first tsunami wave struck the coastline within 20 minutes, the advanced warning provided some residents with crucial minutes to reach a safe area. While the earthquake sent powerful tsunami waves westward toward Japan, the tsunami also propagated east into the Pacific Ocean. Here, warnings are issued by the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, operated by NOAA in Hawaii. NOAA maintains a large network of buoys with ocean floor sensors that are strategically positioned in the earthquake-prone zones of the Pacific. This system collects vital ocean data for tsunami forecasting. On March 11th, only 25 minutes after the earthquake struck, the first buoy station measured the tsunami and relayed information to Hawaii. Scientists used this data to run models and issue forecasts and warnings to nations throughout the Pacific. From there, local emergency managers decided what actions were appropriate to take for public safety. The earthquake and resulting tsunami devastated the Japanese coastline, causing damage that will take years to repair. While we can't prevent these forces of nature from happening, our early warning systems can help us prepare for the dangers headed our way.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a look at the sea ice edge. We do have some easterly flow that's going to start to push the ice pack further to the west, and that's going to last through Friday. However, over the weekend, we're expecting some northerly winds as well as some colder air to come back in, helping to push the ice further to the south. Additionally, when we have winds that are 15 knots or less, it will be cold enough that we do expect some new ice to form along the ice edge. Down in southeast Alaska for Thursday, in the inside waters we have southerly winds 5 to 15 knots. Then in southern locations that's going to switch and become northerly. Out over the far eastern portions of the Gulf waters, northeast winds 20 knots. But as we get closer towards the Sitka area and areas farther to the north, southwest winds 15 knots, picking up to 25 knots as we get into the northern Gulf. On Friday in the inside waters, weaker winds up north, somewhat variable around 10 knots, and then becoming southerly 15 in the southern inside waters. Out over the eastern portions of the Gulf, westerly winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 10 feet, and then farther up to the north by Yakutat, southeast winds 15 knots, becoming north winds 20 in the northern Gulf. Out over the south central area on Thursday, out in the Gulf waters, we have west to northwest winds 30 to 35 knots, strongest by the Barren Islands. And then out over the Cook Inlet area, north to northwest winds 15 to 25 knots, picking up in the southern locations, and up to 40 knots out of the west of the Barren Islands. In the Prince William Sound area, northwest winds 30 knots. On Friday, staying in Prince William Sound, north winds 20 knots are expected. Out over the Gulf waters, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. In the Cook Inlet area, northeast winds 10 to 20 knots, strongest in the south, and then northerly winds 20 knots west of the Barren Islands. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Thursday, in Shelikof Strait, northwest winds 30 knots. On the east side of the island, westerly winds 25 knots. West 20 knots as we get closer towards Chignik, and then south of Sand Point, southerly winds 15 knots. On the Bering side, we're going to have east to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. For Friday, by Kodiak Island area, southerly winds 15 knots on the east side. Shelikof Strait is going to see easterly flow of 15 knots. On the Bering side of the peninsula, we're going to have south to east winds 25 to 30 knots, more easterly and stronger by the Bristol Bay area. On the Pacific side, southerly winds 20 to 25 knots, seas up to as high as 8 feet. On Thursday, out by the eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, southerly winds 20 knots for the central Aleutian Islands, and out by the western Aleutian Islands, southwest winds 25 knots with seas up to as high as 11 feet. On Friday, out by the western Aleutian Islands, west to northwest flow 20 to 25 knots, central Aleutian Islands, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, and then southwest winds 25 knots by the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, we're going to see northerly winds 15 knots in the Norton Sound area, 20 knots by St. Lawrence Island, and 15 knots around Nunavik Island. For St. Matthew Island, easterly winds with 25 knots are expected, and east 30 by the Pribilof Islands. For Friday, in northern locations, we're going to see northeast winds 15 knots for the Norton Sound area, 25 for St. Lawrence Island, 35 knots north of Nunavik Island, and 40 knots by the St. Matthew Island area. Seas up to as high as 18 feet by St. Matthew Island. South of Nunavik Island, easterly winds 35 knots are expected, and then flow switching up quite a bit for the Pribilof Islands. Southwesterly flow 20 knots is expected. For the Arctic coastline in the Beaufort Sea area, we're going to see westerly winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming northerly as we get by Utqiagvik and areas farther to the west 10 to 15 knots. And then at 20 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait of a northwesterly direction, north winds 20 knots south of the strait. On Friday, Beaufort Sea still seeing westerly winds 10 to 15 knots, coming northerly by Utqiagvik 10 to 15 knots. That's going to ride down the west coast of the state until we get south of the Bering Strait, where we'll see northeast winds 25 knots. Quick recap of tonight's weather. We have a front moving through the western and central Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to those areas. Out ahead of this, going to be colder for the Pribilof Islands. Going to see snow there extending down to the eastern Aleutian Islands as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Along the west coast of the state, we will have areas of blowing snow tonight for the Chukchi Sea coast as well as the Bering Strait coast. We do have winter weather advisories out for blowing snow for those areas. Could drop those visibilities down to a half mile or less. Up along the Arctic coastline, we do have some fog developing tonight, and then snow through much of the western mainland, extending down into the interior and south central Alaska areas as we have low pressure in the northern Gulf. We're also going to have some snow in the central and northern locations of the Panhandle, extending out by the Yakutat area. For Thursday, some snow lingering in the northern locations of the Panhandle, as well as a mix of precipitation in the far southern places of the Panhandle. South central Alaska still going to see some snow that will extend up through the Alaska Range and into the interior, and then some areas of snow along the Arctic coastline. Blowing snow will continue, especially in the morning hours along the Chukchi Sea coast and Bering Strait coast, and then down to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have snow out by the Pribilof Islands and Alaska Peninsula, and rain and snow mix for the Aleutians themselves. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.